Let me turn to Manish Sabharwal, and apart from all that you will say, particularly relating to labor, but other issues as well, the sense that I see running through the book of the different interplay of of market failure, which kind of led to this notion that we must plan everything and we must make everything happen because the markets will not deliver. And as against that, the whole notion of government failure, systemic government failure, which of course we've seen many manifestations of more recently. Manish.
Thanks, Shekhar. I work for a people's supply chain company. We've hired somebody every 5 minutes for the last 5 years. So we are obviously a child of lower hiring standards in India. I mean, that's really what's happened in the last 10, 15 years. But I'm also a child of liberalization's 5 labor market transitions, farm to non-farm, rural to urban, unorganized to organized, subsistence self-employment to wage employment, and school to work. In my mind, they're sort of journeys to a better life, but there are 3 problems. There's the matching problem, which is connecting demand to supply. There's a mismatch problem, which is repairing supply for demand. And there's a pipeline problem, which is preparing supply for demand. I distinguish between repair and prepare. I'm going to focus my remarks purely on the labor and the education one. Because for me, it was a wonderful reading on the labor chapter. Because policymakers always tell me 2 things. One thing they say is labor laws don't matter anymore. And the second one is, my labor reform demand is a suicide mission. If I get labor reforms, my business will go away. The only reason I'm alive is because of India's labor laws. And I think both of them are wrong. I think I agree that the first one, that labor laws don't matter. I agree that the transmission losses between how the law is written, interpreted, practiced, and enforced have made it easier for corporate India. But that's a very stupid way to do reform. It's a very inefficient and ineffective way to do reform. There are huge costs of the current labor laws, many of which Arvind has identified. The informality, the firm size, and the capital substitution are very closely related, and productivity. But there's obviously only 12% manufacturing employment. There is massive low-level corruption. I mean, I have 85 guys in regulatory affairs whose full-time job is handling that regulatory cholesterol. But most importantly, the skill financing. I have hired somebody every 5 minutes for the last 5 years, but I've only hired 5% of the kids who came to me for a job. So 40,000 kids come to me, I hire 3,000, 4,000. Why? Because who pays for skill financing when 93% employment is in the informal sector? So 93% or 90%, whatever the number is, informality at the exit gate of skill development and education really kills any market solution for skill financing. I can find something for 5, 7, and that's how I've made my existence. But if I really want to explode, I need more formal employment because that's the only way I'll be able to figure out a financing solution. So if we think about the suicide mission question, that if 90% of informal employment is in total employment, 99% of fixed-term employment is informal. So all of my competitors are criminals or politicians. There's an adverse selection, right? I mean, but what people don't understand is 30% of India's labor force being on fixed-term or contract labor is silly. We shouldn't have 30% of our labor force in contract. That is obviously a child of something else. But 5, 10, 15%, whatever the number may be, that is really when the organized sector will take over. Today, 99% of contract employment being in the informal sector actually creates the silly situation where in contract employment has its own problems. So I had a few specific comments on the chapters. The one was really the informality one. Why has 100% of net job creation since 1991 been in the informal sector? Why is that? I mean, I'm sure Vivek has an explanation. But at a firm level and at an individual level, you mentioned PF and ESI, but 40% salary confiscation. If you add PF, if you add ESI, if you add EDLI, if you add gratuity, if you add PT, if you add in a cost to company world, people find it hard at lower salary levels to live on 60% of their salary. So every time my average salary is 8,000 rupees a month, but many of my kids at 6,000 rupees say, I can't live on 60% of my salary. So one is the 40% level is too high. Second, it's poor value for money. I mean, I pay 3% of the ESI of this country, but only 0.1% of my employees have ever been to an ESI hospital. Every time they go, there's no medicine, there's no doctor. So one of the very important drivers at an individual level, I don't know whether this matters at policy, is people say, well, you know, whenever I give my first salary to kids who join me, they say, at the end of the month, we have actually an outbound calling center which calls them to explain that 40% of your salary is not taken by us. It's going to PF, it's going to ESI, because they say, well, I can walk across the street to that contractor who says he'll give me 7,000 rupees, and he gives me 7,000 rupees in hand. So I am uncompetitive because of 40% salary confiscation. I don't know whether 40 is the right number or 20 is the right number. But currently, the high level of salary confiscation is breeding informality at an individual level where kids say, you know, don't give me SI, please don't give me PF. Please, I do not want to, this, it's a tax, it's not a benefit. And in a CTC world, the poor value of money and the high level is leading to people to just say, please let me stay informal. I'm not going to hold it against you. I do not want PF and ESI. The next one, which I thought might be interesting, you covered the sectoral geography of work quite interestingly. You know, 12% manufacturing employment, 55% agriculture employment. But I think an interesting story is the physical geography of work. You know, 45% of GDP in the next 20 years, at least as of now, looks like it'll be in the south and west of India, and 45% of population growth will be in the east and north of India. So what's going to happen? Is it going to become like China, where 300 million people get on a train every Chinese New Year and go home? Or are we going to be able to take jobs to people, or are we going to take people to jobs? I think that's an interesting sort of matching problem which we'll have to think about, and it might be interesting to put there. The third one was, can skills you unpack from education? I think repair is different from prepare. And while gross enrollment ratios, and we have to get kids in higher education, but you know, the focus on flow, which is very important. You know, India's demographic dividend means 1 million kids will join the labor force every month for the next 20 years. So that's flow. But there are 300 million people in the labor force who will have to be moved out. I mean, the 58% of the population which produces 18% of the GDP, whether it's farm to non-farm or it's low productive services to high productive services, they don't have to go back to higher education. There will be a repair or an emergency response. So the 3 E's are much more closely related. While you're sort of human capital one focused on higher education, if you could add something on skills, because there's a lot of activity going on. We haven't got to outcomes yet, but at least, you know, the biggest realization for me is the 3 E's are much more closely related. You can't teach somebody in 6 months what they should have learned in 15 years. You can't finance skill development unless it leads to a job. So while the government is organized vertically, the problem is a horizontal and the solution is a horizontal. And there is a bit of a market failure in skill development. I think, see, employers aren't willing to pay for training or candidates, but they're willing to pay for trained candidates. Candidates are not willing to pay for training, they're willing to pay for a job. Banks or microfinance aren't willing to lend to the candidate unless a job is guaranteed. And training companies aren't able to fill up their classrooms unless it leads to a job. So the innovation lies at the intersection of higher education, employment, and employability, and that sort of the government is organized vertically, so that's not going to happen. In the higher education chapter, I thought it was great, but besides the regulatory cholesterol and the capacity question, which is very important, I mean just the deregulation question, it might be nice to include also the qualitative and the diversity element of reform. Maybe that's an inevitable concomitant of deregulation, but the whole employer involvement in the vocationalization of higher education, you know, the flexibility, you know, can we have a cloud classroom today? Can we give recognition for prior learning? Can we give credit for on-the-job training, all of today, which has an antibiotic reaction from UGC? The qualification corridor, you know, can a 3-month certificate become an opening balance for a 1-year diploma, for a 2-year associate degree, and a 3-year degree? The stigma of vocational training in India is for 2 reasons. One is it doesn't lead to a job, and second is it's a dead end. You can't use it as an opening balance. So can we think about the 2-year associate degree? You know, that's not a normal degree on a diet. It's vocational training on steroids. And so the community college concept, if you know, part ITI, part employment exchange, part college, that is really the need for, if we want to sort of change the geography of work. The role of the private sector in education, you did a great job with RTE's problems, but I just wanted to add another nuance, and that is something which Shekhar mentioned, is there is a distinction in policy today between the private sector and for-profit. Even though 90% of capacity created in the last 20 years in schools and engineering colleges is for-profit, on paper it is non-profit. So we've created an adverse selection among education entrepreneurs because they're mostly either land mafia or criminals or politicians with where regulatory arbitrage has become important. So what you are on paper is different from what you are in reality. So there is an adverse selection. So we have to get our hands around this. I know that profit is a complicated word overall, but in education it's even more complicated. But today, by forcing people to lie about who they are, about how they finance their money, we're creating an adverse selection among education entrepreneurs, and then a goofy private sector becomes an argument against a legitimate, well-regulated private sector. So, I mean, there was an incisive policymaker who told me 2 weeks ago that, you know, if you were nonprofit, you would be 4 times your size. And I think I agree with him. But the problem is I can't be nonprofit and do what I'm doing with the capital that this needs. So in just wrapping up your labor one section, I was thinking, could you unpack philosophy and plumbing? You know, philosophy is the complex question of, is employment immortal? You know, in India, employment contract is sort of marriage without divorce, right? At least as the law is written right now. Now, it's controversial, you know, hire, fire, will more people get kicked out if you change that law? It's unclear to me. But if you leave the philosophy question as saying, let that be phase 2 labor reform. But in phase 1 labor reform, there's so much to be done around plumbing. For example, PF. You know, Provident Fund doesn't have clients, it has hostages. It is the most expensive government securities mutual fund in the world. It charges 425 basis points for managing a government securities mutual fund. The private sector does it at 25 basis points. So can NPS be an alternative to Provident Fund? I mean, even a public sector alternative to EPFO would be low-hanging fruit, would change the perception of poor value of money. The Apprenticeship Act, there's 2.5 lakh apprentices in this country. Japan has 10 million, Germany has 6 million. Learning by earning, learning by doing is a powerful way. But because of the Apprenticeship Act written in 1961, we only have 2.5 lakh formal apprentices. Employment exchanges. You know, last year to 4 crore people registered, they gave 3 lakh jobs. They're not working. And the interpretation and the contradiction problem which you identified is not a philosophy debate. I mean, I have a legal notice from the Delhi government which says, I will shut you down if you don't pay salaries by cash, from one labor commissioner. And I have one from the other end of Delhi which says you cannot pay by cash. Both of them are valid, because both noble intentions. The guy who said you have to pay by cash said these laborers don't have bank accounts. The guy who says you cannot pay by cash is if you pay by cash, people take advantage of them, so you need to credit and bank account. So just the contradictions and the interpretation issues in labor laws is low-hanging fruit, which very few people disagree. The trade unions don't disagree, the employers don't disagree, most policymakers don't disagree. But the traffic jam in labor has become, oh, it's hire, fire, or it's nothing. So we're proposing 100-0 in labor laws and we're getting 0. From my perspective, we could sort of say, tier the labor law reform into saying plumbing, let's do phase 1, and then let's debate the philosophy. We might make some progress over the rest of it. And the one which I did hope, and I hope you'll be able to include, is really the skills part. That is an important, the higher education GER is an important policy objective, but it's highly unlikely that we'll get to 40% GER inconsistent with sort of the people who need repair and at the cost that repair needs to be done. Thanks.